our next speaker, Bruce Shoemaker, who's joining us from a very late hours in the United States. Bruce, of course, is an independent researcher, is well known for his work on Laos, and you have spent time in Laos and have written about hydropower issues and other issues concerning Laos as well. Of course, Bruce also have this unique, again, experience in the United States about the Klamath dams in Oregon. So I think there's a few things here which he can share with us. His experience in Laos, but also this, the largest dam removal in the US history issue with the Klamath as well. So Bruce Cup, please.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and looking at the screen to see a lot of old friends listening in. I wish I could see you all in person instead of from the other side of the world. So yeah, I was gonna just summarize a little of my work in Laos and kind of where I see hydropower in Laos right now. And then maybe talk about something that could be a little more inspiring, which is the situation that, where I find myself now in far northern California and Oregon. So I am in a, let's see, let me get this up here. Anyway, I'm going to first talk a little bit about kind of how we got here with hydropower. And as you might know, a lot of the history of hydropower came from about 100 years ago or more, where dam building really started in the United States and Europe, some other developed countries. And we were, you see some of this now, I think, in places like Laos, where the developing hydropower was seen as a big symbol of national development, a patriotic, nationalistic activity. And, this is actually from a record album from a famous folk singer, Woody Guthrie, who in the 1930s sang about hydropower dams, kind of to inspire Americans to support it and think of it as a patriotic, important activity for national development. So, during the Cold War period, the US and other Western countries, somewhat through the World Bank and other multilateral groups, began promoting large hydropower to developing countries. And actually, I don't know if everybody knows this, but in the 1970s, it was the US Agency for International Development that first did studies of the mainstream Mekong dams and was moving towards studying them and possibly supporting dams on the mainstream of the Mekong, and did some early plans and design work for them. And then the World Bank also supported the first large hydropower project in Laos, Nam Num, and but then all those plans sort of got delayed or stopped by the the changes of government in 1975 in Laos and the region. So, as hydropower began to be promoted and went to developing countries, we started to see a lot of the problems with it around resettlement, livelihoods, human rights violations, and so we started to have protests emerge against hydropower in the 80s. This shot's from India, but as those of you in Thailand know, that also in the 80s and 90s became a big feature in Thailand with opposition to Bak Moon and other projects. So after that series, and the World Commission on Dams, which criticized hydropower extensively, the World Bank wanted to stay in the game with hydropower, and they promoted Nam Tun 2, which was approved in 2005 as a new model of hydropower in Laos that would have positive social and environmental benefits. And so they did a big public relations campaign on having their first big new model of hydropower be in Laos. And it's interesting because, you know, they chose a country to do their new model where people did not actually have a right to say no to it. But yeah, it had a lot of rhetoric about public participation and consultation, and that this would be a great new model. I, together with actually 17 researchers, did this book 3 years ago. We published about Nam Ton 2, where we talked about a lot of the failings of the project on both economic and social and environmental grounds. I'm not going to go into all that tonight, but but even as the World Bank was promoting Nam Ton 2 as this new model, you know, we saw that it actually had a lot of negative effects. So what happened was that both the World Bank's Nam Ton 2 project and then also the Asian Development Bank's Tonle Sap project, which was completed in 1998, were portrayed as these successful models of hydropower that that basically set up the systems for investment in Laos and set the whole framework for private hydropower investment. And you know, they used the rhetoric of sustainable hydropower and talking about how, in addition to having national economic development, these hydropower projects would be positive. You know, there was a lot of rhetoric about local community benefits, and so all of a sudden, you know, we saw the number of proposed and under development projects in Laos really explode in the early 2000s and up until the present time, both including on the mainstream of the Mekong. So we've also seen how a lot of even Western donors continue to support this idea of sustainable hydropower. Even though a lot of the financing at this point is not from Western countries, it's from China, Korea, Vietnam, other places, but basically we saw a lot of donors for a long time be very supportive of this development strategy in Laos, and I would say not pay nearly enough attention to some of the negatives, which were basically that these large projects are being supported in a country where the people just do not have the right to say no. You know, there's no right to say no. You can't complain or say no to these projects. We also have seen a lot of poorly implemented resettlement and not enough attention to what happens to people's fishery-based livelihoods. And then we also a lack of capacity in the country for proper regulation or oversight. And I think we can, I think Prem will talk about Xe Pian-Xe Namnoy, but that's certainly what we saw happen there 3 years ago. So when I'm looking at this from the perspective of villagers and what has happened to village communities that have been near the sites of these hydropower projects, and one right from the point when environmental impact statements are done and the first environmental assessments are done, there's a lack of recognition of traditional livelihood systems. The fact that most people are dependent on fishing, they use the wetlands, they use the forests that are all often lost with these projects. And so a lot of my early work was looking at downstream impacts, the fact that not all the impacts of a hydropower project are right in the reservoir area where people have to be resettled, but it's also about their livelihoods, especially the fisheries, the migratory fish issues. But we've also seen what resettlement assistance does occur focuses on infrastructure, like things that are, can be contracted and built, like schools and roads and houses. And, that's where a lot of the money is, and officials are able to make, be involved in these construction companies and make money on it. But there's very little recognition of restoring livelihoods that people had when they get displaced by these projects. And we've both seen that in this emergency that's occurred with Xe Pian-Xe Namnoy, and also with just the other ongoing projects that you have very little concern about compensating for fisheries or livelihood losses. So there'll often be some nice houses built, maybe kind of nice, but there's very little compensation or any type of mitigation for the loss of people's fisheries and livelihood losses. And as anybody who's familiar with Laos knows, if villagers complain, they can get in trouble. Two colleagues of mine just recently wrote a paper that I think I would point to as a good summary of what is going on with hydropower in Laos, and they express a lot of the same frustrations I've had with trying to do things, because it just doesn't seem like, however many capacity building projects, institutional strengthening, donors love to put money into these projects, like for training, study tours for government officials, but none of it actually seems to be working because certain people are making too much money on it. And so it's extremely difficult to see how to stop this this very fast rush to hydropower and these ill-conceived projects without some real fundamental reforms in how decisions are made in the country. And I think donors could do a lot more than they have. I'm very glad, Kun Montira, to hear that UNESCO is trying to do what it can. A lot of the other donors need to do more to try to put some pressure on, because scientists, researchers are not listened to, and local people are not listened to right now in Laos. So it's a very difficult situation to see how to get better decision making among within the Lao government. I went to my first meeting on Nam Tuntu in 1991, if you can believe that, a long time ago. And so I've been following this for a long time, and it's very difficult to see a positive outcome right now of what can happen. Anyway, I do want to talk a little bit about something that could be a positive inspiration, I hope, for the future, is that at the same time that hydropower is being developed very rapidly in the Mekong region, we're seeing in other countries that there's a really big reconsideration of the costs and legacies of these projects, and in both in the United States and in Europe now, we've seen hundreds and thousands of small weirs and dams removed, basically when they've outlived their usefulness, and they have been part of really a growing movement to look at the importance of rivers. And a lot of it has to do with fish. And in the United States, it has to do with a species called salmon, which is a very popular healthy food for people. And it's also been the basis of livelihoods for many indigenous communities for many, historically. And so what happened was, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, all these dams were built in the United States and in Europe with no consideration, just very similar to what's happening in Laos or the Mekong region. They just did not really study or really care about the impacts on native communities. And so there has been, when I moved back from from Southeast Asia and moved back to the States, I found myself very coincidentally in this region of far northern California and southern Oregon, where the Klamath River runs. And this was one of the most important salmon producing rivers in the Western United States. And in starting in the 1920s and up to the 1960s, there was four dams built on the mainstream of the Klamath River, and it had a huge negative impact on salmon fishery, together with agricultural diversions this was a very important source of culture and livelihoods for the the indigenous tribes that lived in this area. There's four major tribes that all depended on the Klamath River. And for many decades, nobody cared or paid any attention to it at all. And then in more recent years, there's been a movement to get rid of to remove these dams, and it was led by the indigenous communities. And so this is a cascade of 4 dams all on the Klamath River, and it somewhat reminds me of, if you go to northern Laos, there's the U River, a tributary of the Mekong in Luang Prabang province, where we've recently seen the construction of a series of dams on the U River, seven dams actually in total, and that's having a devastating impact on the fishery and people's livelihoods on the U River. And so it was very interesting to me to see a place where there was a cascade of dams. This is another lower down one, which is the earth and fill dam called Iron Gate. So there's 4 large dams here, and there's been a campaign that took more than 20 years, led by the indigenous tribes, to ask for these dams to be removed. And we've now are on the track to success. They're not out yet, but there's a plan for them to all be removed. Starting in about 18 months, a year and a half, will be the actual physical removal of these 4 large dams. And it's it's sort of an amazing story how this happened. And it relates to a number of factors that are present in the United States right now. One is that it was the tribes, the indigenous people themselves, that led the campaign as they became more empowered and aware of how to try to influence policy. It was the indigenous groups themselves who led this campaign. But this happened also as part of a wider cultural change in the United States, where the plight of Native Americans, indigenous people, became more widely recognized. There's sort of a cultural shift where there's just more concern about social justice and human rights for indigenous communities. So they were able to use that sort of change in the culture to promote the idea of this as a social justice issue, that their communities depended on salmon for their livelihood and their culture, and the only way to get that back was to remove these dams and let the fish run in the river again. So, but this was not an easy thing. It's been a campaign for more than 20 years at this point. And it was a very interesting campaign. The 4 dams are owned by a private company, a power company. And so the campaign focused on both government officials, but also on the company itself. And every year they would have people from the tribes went to the stockholder meeting. They're owned by the company's owned by a American billionaire, Warren Buffett. And so they would go to the annual shareholder meeting and and have a big protest demonstration outside. Now, these are the things you can do in some countries, but obviously this wouldn't work in Laos right now. But another big aspect of it was coalition building. They got environmental groups to join, the fishing industry off the Pacific coast, which was dependent on salmon and had been impacted by the loss of the fishery, and also some of the farmers who were actually being, because these dams weren't used for irrigation, they're just used for power production. So they were able to convince some of the agricultural community that they'd be better off and have more water for themselves if the dams were free and fish could survive. Another technique that was used was environmental regulation, and California had over decades, they'd increased their standards for water quality, and these dams were holding back, were creating a lot of bad water with algae and water that was too warm for fish to survive in once it got released. Anyway, I'm just kind of starting this research. This is the Klamath, the mouth of the Klamath River. And it's what I'm interested in looking at is just how dam removal, just the fact that dam removal is starting to be is happening. This is going to be the biggest dam removal we think in the world for 4 large hydropower dams. But it's not going to be the only one. There's already plans to take out some ones that will be even larger than this on another river in maybe 3 or 4 years. So I've been trying to look at how this could be inspiring for people in the Mekong. I think for decision makers, it's important to know that this whole hydropower industry is being reconsidered now, because so many of the bad effects were just ignored and not thought about when these dams were built. And now 30, 50, 80 years later, it's very clear what effect they've had on the environment and on people's livelihoods. So hopefully we're going to see some change, and that this will just be the start of a larger movement. So I'm going to end there, but can take questions later. Thank you.